So the play Intimate Apparel was actually probably one of my favorite plays that I've read so far in this course. And it brought up a lot of different issues. For one, a little bit it brought up race relations. So specifically, you can think of Mrs. Van Buren and Esther, exactly how like she thought they were friends at some points, and then Esther said they weren't, and also like how Miss Van Buren wanted to go with Esther to certain areas to go to a theater production, but wouldn't allow Esther to go with her to the opera. In addition, it brings a lot of friend relations, some between May, Mr. Dixon, and Esther. How Miss Dixon brought up a lot about how she should get married, and then May said Esther probably doesn't have to. But then also, there's a lot of different like spousal relations, just in general, how women in that time needed to be married. But then also like the spousal relations between Esther and George as well, and just how George tried to manipulate her, and all this is very, very interesting. But then we get to question two. One of the values I saw in this play was the importance of a spouse, important of being a spouse as a woman. Specifically, Mrs. Van Buren, she couldn't imagine being single in the 30s. That's something that's kind of different than today. As well as Mrs. Dixon, she would tell Esther that she needed to be married, and then Esther not wanting a man until that man actually arrived, and then she really did want to have a relationship. Along with Mrs. Dixon, she also settled a little bit for Mr. Dixon because she felt that it was more important to have a spouse and settle than to not have a spouse at all. Also, there's a lot of another value from question two, which are race relationships. And you could say Mrs. Van Buren, she once I said earlier, she wanted to go play production with Esther, but Esther had already. But Esther said, "Can I go to the opera with you?" And she was not a fan of that, and it didn't really help. And Esther and Mrs. Van Buren would only help Esther if she wouldn't get found, if no one else would know. Like she helped Esther write all of those letters to George, but then when she wanted to be friends with Esther, Esther's like, "What have you ever really done for me? You've never even let me inside of the doors of your house." And following up, going to question three, one of the things that I noticed was Mrs. Van Buren saying that maybe she'll be a bohemian needing a husband. She's not bound by convention. And what that means is Bohemians pretty much they don't like live a conventional lifestyle. They don't have any permanent ties. So I was confused, and she said that at the time, and it made more sense. She was thinking if she didn't have her husband, everything would work out a little bit better. So another thing for this play specifically in question four, it mentions on the issue of diversity. And so one thing is that this play reinvented like the image of African Americans. Esther herself, she just did not portray what you typically expect at that time. She loved a Iranian Jewish immigrant, and she also stood up to apparently a white lady. She stood up to Mrs. Van Buren, which is not something that's always seen in that timeline. And then she also stood up to her husband. She stood up to George, which is something different. Well, another thing is stereotypes from question five. Yes, stereotypes do still occur. I see them every day. I see them in my own personal life. And they come from people just generalizing a trait that you may have noticed in a group that could be based on religion, gender, or race. And like you can see like black people on TV, they seem athletes, so every black person you see is an athlete. Something along those lines happens all the time. And I've done this myself, but by like noticing that, a lot of my stereotypes have become non-existent. So my two questions are, one, why do you think Esther waited so long to tell Mamie why she had slept with George after she saw the jacket? And two, why was Mrs. Van Buren so upset when Esther called her out on them not being friends?